Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming and spending your lunchtime with us today. Brief introduction, so I'm Nathan Hopkins. I head up the sales function at a technology company called Escrow London. We specialise in providing software and SaaS escrow solutions and supporting customers, selling generally to larger enterprise clients and effectively looking at risk mitigation and things like that. So we're joined by a couple of guests and we'll introduce those in a moment. In terms of what we do and where we're based, you may have guessed that I've got a London accent or an English accent. So I am based in London, but we are an international company. We sell to clients all over the globe, including many in Australia, including organisations such as the Australian government, various blue light services, emergency services, hospitals, things like that, as well as various other enterprises, banks, fintechs, and kind of everything in between. So hopefully we'll have a good discussion today about various kind of opportunities and ways that you can support your clients. Our founders are actually from Sydney, although they're currently based in the UK, and saw an opportunity and a gap in the market where organisations were going to be adopting much more software as a service and moving away from a traditional kind of on-prem hosted solution to basically cloud-based services and solutions. So that's where we were kind of founded back in 2015 and had kind of radical growth in supporting clients in effectively onboarding new technology. So for those that don't really know what software escrow is, it's effectively a mechanism to effectively mitigate risk and hold critical software assets that can be utilised by a beneficiary or another party should something happen to the software vendor. So it's kind of like an insurance policy for software effectively. Typically situations such as bankruptcy or financial challenges are the kind of situation where we can provide most value, but usually for critical software and onboarding those types of technologies, our solution can really provide some value added benefits to you and hopefully your client. The most typical situation is where there's a licensed SaaS provider maybe, or a software company and a licensed customer. We also get involved in situations maybe where investors looking to protect their interest in investing in technology and scale-ups and startups, as well as organisations who are utilising third-party software vendors to actually build and develop some IP for them. So lots of different situations we get involved with, but yeah, predominantly I think today based on the panel talking about software vendors and how they've sold to larger clients, things like that. A bit of background. So we are a formal AWS partner, as well as registered on both AWS and Microsoft Azure Marketplace. Personally, I've been involved in kind of the Amazon ecosystem and training since 2016, more from a kind of sales and marketing point of view. But yeah, a lot of experience in effectively cloud-based solutions and things like that, which no doubt a lot of you will bought or developed your platforms on. That's enough about me. I'll introduce, we've got two Gregs with us today. So Greg, will probably hand over yourself, just a quick intro, background, and go from there.
Thank you, Nathan. My name is Greg Steiniger. I'm the CTO at Cache Investment Management. I've been at Cache for about 18 months. But prior to that, I worked at CBA for 4 years, running programs and dealing with small vendors and that type of thing. So I kind of know both sides of that. But what Cache does, we provide APIs to allow our customers to create apps, like phone apps, for people to do micro investing. So they basically design an app, and we provide the API that connects with the registry and makes sure that on a daily basis, the fund administration is complete. That's what we do.
And I am Greg Palumbo. I'm a partner at Maddocks. We are a law firm, proudly Australian law firm. We're full service. I work in the technology and commercial team primarily. So I represent customers and suppliers of technology and outsourcing arrangements, licensing, IP, from kind of small startup scale-ups to large institutional clients like CBA, Aristocrat. So we kind of run the gamut of our practice in terms of what we see from a technology side. And I do a lot of technology contracting. So I like to joke I'm less a lawyer and more a contract negotiator, but which I like it that way. But that's really kind of what we deal with, and we help our clients when there are, in particular, issues around escrow, arrangements around escrow, IP licensing, ownership, development, things like that.
Amazing. Well, yeah, pleased to have you both on. So Greg's actually a customer of ours, and somebody we've done a lot of work with Maddocks as well in supporting their clients and different types of requirements they're looking for when onboarding technology. So in terms of the kind of agenda for the session, I'm going to just introduce kind of some market trends, which won't be anything new to you. But before I do that, we just have a show of hands who wants to have more customers than they do at the moment. Okay, it's a good start. And maybe just a split of hands between people who work for technology companies and then other side people maybe for an end user company. I assume most are going to be tech companies, but tech companies. And then any end users in here? Couple in the middle. Amazing, thank you. So yeah, if you do have any questions, we'll probably save them to the end just because it's quite a big audience at the moment, but hopefully we'll have some time for those. And as you noticed, we do have a videographer with us today as well. So at the end, if anyone wants to give us some feedback, we'd love some. If you're willing to be on camera and give us just 10 seconds of your thoughts of how we thought today, that would be amazing as well. So yeah, in terms of those market trends, what we're seeing is general huge adoption in software as a service, but generally just technology. You know, we see it in all of our lives these days. In every industry, it's getting affected by the adoption of technology. And specifically software as a service away from legacy hosting models of on-prem software. But particularly obviously where we get involved, we're seeing a lot of and an increase in the number of insolvencies and bankruptcies across the marketplace. You saw things like the Silicon Valley Bank go down a couple of years ago, and the pressure on startups to remain well-funded and support their customers in that way. And that's a big risk potentially for end users who are potentially going to adopt technology. So looking at the statistics here in Australia, 2021 to 2022, there was I think it was 95% increase in the number of insolvencies for technology companies. And then the following year is an additional 20%, and they're predicting another increase in that this year. So it is a genuine concern and real situation that we're seeing. Although there's best intent from startup scale-ups to never be in that situation, you know, it's a real risk potentially for clients of theirs. And that's usually the situation where we come in and can add the most value from us as an organization. Yeah, in terms of the kind of risks that maybe clients are looking for, I think both of you will be able to answer this question, but yeah, what general risks, maybe you start with you, Greg, of when your clients are coming to you, what are they looking for?
Yeah, so I think having come from CBA and then joining a very small scale up of only 16 people, I knew actually going in what types of questions would kind of come up because at CBA we would have all sorts of vendors come and offer us all sorts of services and things, and there was always questions like, you know, what happens how are we going to manage the risk of you being insolvent? How are we going to manage the risk of loss of data, right? Our customers' PII information, you know, what protections do you have in place to make sure that that doesn't happen? How do we actually address fraud risk? You know, because I think oftentimes larger companies will always think, well, small startup companies are sketchy and they hire sketchy people and they're going to steal all the data. And they're basically going to take away all the good stuff and disappear, float off into, you know, we used to tease one of our customers in Ghana, like, what do you think we're going to do? Just get on a boat together and sail off into the South Sea with your money and your customer, you know, and your information. But yeah, it's the risk around, you know, their reputational risk. I having worked at CBA, I know that, for example, oftentimes the risk that you're worried about is maybe, you know, there's whether regulators will approve what you're doing, whether management's going to go with it, whether your customers are going to like it, but also are your peers going to like it, right? When the work with a scale up or a startup goes belly up, and you're kind of still working next to these people every single day, and they're like, "Hey, Greg, good one, well done on that one." So I mean, there's a lot of risk, right? So, but I think probably just being that companies like us remain solvent and continue to deliver is probably the biggest thing that I would ask. Just
on that reputation one, do you think that's on a personal level, or the people that are maybe onboarding that, or do you think that's more a brand end user type thing?
I think it's at all levels, right? I think there's your peers in the office. There's your customers, right? Who are these? Why did this company spend all this money to build a software product with a company that just failed? Like we're still not getting better service, and they've just wasted time and money. So. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And yourself, Greg?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think a lot of the risks are similar. Now, from my perspective, because I operate on both the supplier side and the customer side, the concerns are different depending on which side of the fence you're working with. I think from a customer side, so if we have a large institutional client who's working with a scale-up company, service continuity is key. And to that, I think goes questions around insolvency, making sure that services are working and actually are operating properly. So service levels, things along those lines. What happens when things aren't going well, either from a service perspective or an insolvency? So things like escrow arrangements, step-in rights. Question, I always like to ask then is, well, if we have step-in rights, are you actually going to be able to do anything? Like, will you be able to operate it? If not, then why are we focused on that? IP, whether it's ownership, licensing, what those rights are, what happens with things that are developed over the course of an arrangement. If it's a SaaS product, what those terms look like, termination rights, if things aren't going well, is a big key issue. So it really there's a lot of key themes. Liability is always a fun one. Always is probably one of the last ones to get solved, but indemnities, liabilities, things like that, we spend a lot of time advising on, because at the end of the day, while people like to think it's a legal decision, it's really a risk decision. It's a commercial decision. So we just like to try and help people with that. And then I think the topic of at least the year is data security and protection, data breaches, cyber risk, things along those lines.
Yeah, for us, the data piece is huge these days, whereas historically Escrow was predominantly focused around source code, particularly when an on-prem solution. But these days, when the service provider is hosting the whole platform, the data, and the client may not ever have access to their data, and they're trusting service provider with that, it's always a huge thing for them, and potentially even the most valuable piece of it. So whatever your product may be doing, it's creating some data off the back of it that they may be able to use moving forward. So that's usually a key part of our discussions these days, particularly with software as a service. The SLA piece I'm interested in, don't quite know my question here, but they basically know they want to mitigate some risk, and they just want to force the vendor onto having an SLA of some sort so they can contractually squeeze them.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's leverage, right? Exactly, is what it is. And so it's okay, how do we ensure that we're getting a base level of product, right? And I think it depends on how critical the product is as well. So what those SLAs will look like, and more importantly, what the enforcement of them looks like. That's where I think it gets a bit sticky. And I will say we're seeing a lot less of service credit arrangements and whatnot. Vendors are really, again, from a customer perspective, vendors are very hesitant to kind of want to dilute down the fees that they're getting. And it will be more about kind of bringing the service back up to par, what those response SLAs look like, and more committing to time. And then I think it's more than a termination event if things aren't going well, rather than we're going to give you service credits back.
Yeah. Okay. And are there any practical measures that maybe from the other side you could put in place prior to getting to that stage, or what clients are looking for generally around risk? Or
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think there's a lot of things that you can do, but if you're at the point of being close to signing a contract, it's difficult. Right, so obviously we have lots of questions about cybersecurity, and we're trying to be ISO 27001 certified, and we've done a bunch of things, and we've worked with partners like DNX to actually get ourselves ready to do that. But that's not something that you can basically say, oh yeah, we'll commit to this and we'll do it in the next month. Right, that just doesn't happen. So I think that there's different things you can do. You can demonstrate, we have policies that show this is how we handle data, and this is how, we do have password policies in place, and we have MFA and all these things. But, you have to, there's a bunch of things that you can show, but I don't know if any of you have ever gone through a due diligence where you get 300 questions and you just spend literally weeks just answering all these questions, and then you're like, well, we don't really have a policy on that, right? And then how do we, are we being honest about that? Do we have it? Is it something we'll just implement as soon as we're done? So that, there's things like that come up. So I think it's easy to put together some policies that match, but there's also the actual practical part of doing them. So you can talk about ISO certification. You could be SOC 2 certified. In our case, we need to be GS 007 certified. All of these things, and we can demonstrate. We can show the partners we work with. We can have penetration testing done on our stack and that type of thing. But ultimately, what it comes down to, I think, is risk management, just for our customer to say, they also want to know, for example, how long our runway is, like how many months we're going to be able to stay solvent, like where our cash flow is. So they ask very, invasive questions, just to say, we don't trust that you're going to be here in, 6 months. So with your 3 months from insolvency, you have to let us know. So there's a lot of things that come up and are asked for, and so. with escrow, for example, it's one of those things where we can say, well, at least we're going to guarantee, we can mitigate your risk that you lose access to the code. We can guarantee that it'll be independently kept, and that Nathan will basically say, yeah, Cache isn't around anymore, so we're going to give it to this customer.
It's not my decision, obviously.
Yeah.
Naturally. So you mentioned very specific question there, though. What is your cash flow? Are there any other specific questions that you kind of generally come up against? You mentioned the security stuff.
Yeah, different things. I want to know about the composition of our board. How many years of risk management experience, because we're in a regulated industry, investment management, just the CVs of everyone who's working there, what they've done, where they've been doing, whether there's any criminal record there. So there are a lot of questions that, that come up. And I think there's a point, right? For example, they asked whether we had penetration testing done, and then they asked to see the results of penetration testing. And I think as a small company, oftentimes you're a little bit afraid, like you can't say no to things. But I don't think you should ever give anyone the findings of your penetration testing. And so we just went back to them and said, no, we have some findings, we're addressing them, but we're not going to give you the opportunity to exploit those. So no, that's the line that we're going to draw. We'll show you when it was done, and with our penetration testing partner, they can say, yeah, we certify that we completed this, and there are generally no critical issues, but we don't list. There's no list of the actual, what failed. So I think, and that's another thing too. I know, having come from a bank, I know that you would always try to take advantage of the smaller partner, basically, to see what you could get away with, because the smaller company needs you more than you need them. So I think sometimes it's just that question, where do you draw the line and say, yeah, we'll answer these questions, but not those questions. This is, let's discuss what you're still uncomfortable with, but we're not giving you everything. And that's a difficult line. That's a call that everyone has to make on their own and basically consider. So. And
are there any specific ones, maybe from a regulatory point of view? I know Stone talked to a lot with fintech specifically. Is there any common themes across how they may frame the compliance questions?
So I think what you can see is generally with all the customers we've had recently, banks and investment management companies, they always come from a kind of a standardized set, which is probably more ISO 27001 aligned and SOC 2. So I think the questions are very similar. They're kind of like, it is easy. Once I would recommend, if you don't have already, first time you're asked to do due diligence, keep the questions in such a way that the next time you get a questionnaire, it's just copy and paste back in, right? It's a consistency thing, but it also saves you literally weeks of time just to basically say, these are standard answers.
So it's interesting on the compliance. So obviously I'm mainly based in the UK, and obviously London's got a big financial centre. There's a lot of pressure now on risk mitigation for these kind of markets, where if they are onboarding third-party suppliers, they have to have effectively an exit strategy, how they would move away from that, and then effectively testing that they can rebuild a solution if it goes down. This is a big problem at the moment for lots of banks. We're working with the UK. Australia have actually just last year effectively trying to mirror some of the regulations we have over in the UK, and then being enforced in 2025. So if you do sell to banks, something to be potentially aware of in and around that space. But there's just a general theme. You think about GDPR that we have in the EU, and a general data protection security question. Okay, yeah, go for it.
So a couple of questions that came up. How long did it take for a startup or a scale-up to engage with a bank, say CBA? Is the process, is it a couple of quarters, is it 3 quarters? Say that a new startup, it's got $1 million in revenue, haven't done anything, so.
Yeah, this is a really good question. So just my own experience, not working on the commercial side, but working on the institutional side with large limit management products, it could be years. Literally, like it can be years. I think one of the things to be cognizant of is when they actually set their budgets and trying to sell to them just before they do that, right? Because there's always a challenge, right? I think most departments in banks are run very carefully to budget. And if they actually, if you basically say it goes from July 1st to June 30th, if you're trying to sell to them in September, they're not gonna have the money for it until, if it's even possible, until July the next year. So it's about thinking about things like, do you start going after them in March, April, May, so that they can actually build that into the budget. The likelihood that you're going to get, that they're going to work with you is much dependent on whether they can actually have the budget to pay for the project.
And I'll add on to that. Then you have the contracting piece, and banks are notoriously difficult to negotiate, but for good reason. There are a lot of regulatory obligations that they have. They have strict standards they need to meet, and that gets passed through the contract. So, the contracts, depending on the risk that the product is going to face, will be more or less onerous depending on that. But it also depends on kind of the urgency of the product, how critical it is. Some things will get kind of sped up if they need to meet that urgency. That's when we tend to be brought in because the internal team just doesn't have the bandwidth to deal with that. But I've been working on things that have been going on for years just because it's kind of been rolling over at a slower pace.
And one final question is, okay, you have an SLA, say industry standard, have you seen clauses that are punitive from a financial perspective if the supplier doesn't meet certain SLAs?
Yeah, so that's the service credit concept that I was kind of talking about before, which would be, and now we would say they're not punitive, and there'd actually be a clause in there that says they're not punitive, but that they are in fact, just a compensation for the lack of service that was provided. That's a lawyerly way of saying, we have to get around some of the legal requirements. But I am seeing, to be honest, a little bit of a push away from service credits and really strong SLA enforcement mechanisms, and more relying on things like termination rights to just kind of say we're done.
You see the other way where banks also, if they don't perform, the supplier can get credits or it's a reverse.
In what context?
Let's say the bank doesn't perform or has it. Maybe it's not so much with the bank, but I had a third party and I was engaging with them, and look, if they were downtime, they'd be compensated. Or you've got maybe banks giving their market power, you don't see that.
Yeah, I mean, so generally, again, if I'm putting my customer hat on, right, and I'm representing the bank in that, we would say we're not going to agree to financial penalties, but what we will say is your performance will be delayed, such that if we're impacting your ability to perform, you're obviously then not required to perform, but we're not going to pay you for that. So that's the customer's perspective on that, of just saying, we're hiring you to do something, but like if we can't, if we have other dependencies or whatnot that aren't being met, like you won't be obligated to perform, you won't be in breach for not performing, but we're not going to necessarily pay you for that.
Just on that one thing, for example, and I think this is better, so when I started my career back in the early 2000s, everything was a fixed price contract, and that's a lot more difficult. It's better actually if you work out, the number of resources you need per month, so that at least your staff can continue to get paid, because banks are notoriously slow. Like the amount of time it takes boards to prove things. Right? You have an idea, there's a decision you need to spend, for whatever reason the bank asks for their scope creep. They need another, the budget that they're at is now at the point where it needs a higher level of approval. It just takes a really long time. So I would actually say, the best thing to do is kind of set up a signing or like a implementation fee, some bit, but then also time and material on the staff resources you're going to put. So at least you can guarantee that the people on your side keep working on it. But that it's difficult. Like banks are not going to give you, again, because they can say, you need us more than we need you. So it's not really fair.
The leverage is not the same.
Yeah.
But yeah, contractually, you mentioned there, contractually is the point where it comes in, SLA, service credits. In the UK, as mentioned, escrow has been mentioned, and I'm obviously slightly biased, but it's one mechanism to potentially alleviate some of those concerns that, should you not be around, or you're not performing, or whatever reason, based on certain predefined agreed events between the two parties, that you can come to a mutual solution. Interesting for your experience, is it more of a collaborative thing, like in terms of discussing those release events and default events, and to generally provide them some comfort?
Yeah, so I just say we were actually put in a position where we said we're not going to sign the contract unless you show that within 90 days of signing that you have an escrow agent. So I had to go find one. Then we found Escrow London. But, so we were put into that position. But I think it's okay, because actually you can look at it one way, to say, well, now we have to put code into escrow. But then it also becomes a feature that you can sell the next time, right? So we have a multi-tenancy agreement. So for example, the first customer asked for it. but the incremental cost of having a multi-tenancy was well worth the cost, right? So now when we go out to new customers, before they even ask, we can say, and if you're concerned about us, we can put code in escrow, or code is already in escrow. You just have to sign up to the multi-tenancy agreement. Well, there's a charge for that, and it's a revenue opportunity from our side. And basically they can say, well, now we have this insurance in place. We know that they're serious about this, and that it's actually something that we can leverage. So I think we were put in a position we had to do it, but I don't know how many of you have done escrow like it used to be, which was physical deposit of a disk that had the quarterly or maybe annual release of the code, and you had to take it to some place and go through levels of security, and then you had to sign it in, and it was very costly. Like, it's very different. Our code is basically, our Git repositories are replicated into Escrow London every single night. DNX helped us set that up. And actually a database for the specific customer is also replicated. So it's automatic every single day. So it's really, if we can get it into Git, we can get it into Escrow London. So
it's a big thing these days, particularly for you guys, obviously stretch for resources. Smaller companies want to automate as much as we can, and we were first to market delivering that kind of functionality a number of years ago. Also, clients love it. They can rest easy knowing there's less chance of human error, things are running in the background, and who doesn't like automation, right? Kind of from a legal point of view, like, how does it work from maybe a licensing thing? Just know your point of view, like what actually rights they get, because we often get questions from people maybe nervous around doing this type of thing.
In terms of the escrow
ownership of
arrangement?
the IP and
I mean, that's a choose your own adventure, really, depending on what the arrangement is. I would say what I have more experience of in terms of drafting the contracts, it's more IP development arrangements where the vendor is building IP. They don't want to turn it over until it's actually finalized and paid for. Most importantly, right, the client doesn't necessarily want to pay for it until it's done. So they might put it into escrow. You don't necessarily need the daily updates then, but there'll be some arrangement, and then there's the trigger events of when you can access that, and then you negotiate what those rights are to that. But that depends really on the deal. Like, you can have anything where it is just you get the right to use whatever software is in there, or it can be an ownership event as well, where they just say, okay, if this is triggered, and depending on the trigger events, like, it's a big enough thing that we just need to own that, so we can take it and go and do whatever we want with it, because the critical nature, we're going to own it anyway or whatnot. So it really does depend from an IP perspective what the arrangement that's negotiated between the parties from a commercial perspective is.
And just taking a few steps back in terms of there's obviously sometimes an imbalance, right? We spoke about that a minute ago. How much do the end users actually think about that and be like, we're going to try and strong arm them here? And obviously appreciate part of your job as a lawyer is partly to do that.
100%.
Right.
I mean, that is my job, right? It's to understand where the leverage is, and then to help the clients make some of those risk determinations based off of that, and say, okay, like, yeah, we can push for all of these things, but are we going to get them? Probably not on all of the things. Let's focus on what's important. Let's focus on what's critical. But it's also really understanding what that risk profile is for the client. How important is this business? Are you really keen? Are you not? But that's that's on both sides. So from a supplier perspective,
have you seen any of the developers do anything particularly good when trying to hold their own, if you know what I mean, and back themselves?
I mean, there's oftentimes I'm quite surprised by the way the leverage is actually played out, especially for some of my larger clients, where I was like, oh, this is going to be fun. We're going to get to steamroll them, and then they don't, because if the product is unique enough, if it's good enough, if they really need it, then it really does level the playing field between the parties. So it kind of, everyone's coming to the table. It also kind of just depends on strategy and perspective, and different clients just have different approaches. And luckily, a lot of mine, they really do kind of take a more balanced approach to some of those things. But where there is no wiggle room, like, we make it clear.
Yeah. Anything you want to add about imbalances, or how you felt maybe in those negotiations?
I mean, I think with imbalances, there are always ways where, like, you think of why you're actually agreeing to the imbalance, right? The revenue upside of it is so much higher than basically getting 15 small customers, right? So there are reasons why you could do it. You obviously wouldn't be considering if it wasn't going to be something that's probably going to take your business up a couple of notches. So it's worth doing. I think one of the other things that's interesting about it is, oftentimes, like, this is a discussion there's things that escrow is and there's things that isn't. For example, it's not a guarantee that just because you have access to the code that you're going to be able to manage it going forward. Like a lot of companies, if they don't have it, so CBA is maybe a little bit different. Large banks here, because they have their own tech teams, they could probably manage it. But like who we're dealing with now, they don't have their own developers, right? So there's also another thing, like if our custom company was insolvent, I'm pretty sure our developers would have no problem getting jobs immediately afterwards because our customers would just say, we're taking the code and we want your people to come work for us. So we can actually, that's good for us. Like we can say our developers always have a job, right? It may not be with us, but it's actually, we don't have to worry about.
Yeah, it's a very common situation. We saw. So we did even a high level continuity service for a client. This time was an international airline. They were using a third-party booking system. It was their main revenue-generating software that was used to book the flights, pay for the seats, do all that stuff. That vendor went into bankruptcy, and the client was like, "Crap, like what we're going to do?" They obviously invoked us. We also had pre-agreed a service implemented at the moment. But at the point of a trigger, we were able to redeploy the service on their behalf, manage that for 3 months. They were able to upskill themselves internally. Get some additional resource, and this time it was potentially hire some third-party resources, and then take that on internally. So we were kind of a stopgap solution, run that for a period of time, buy them essentially some time to get themselves in order to then take that on long term. So yeah, question.
Just in an insolvency situation,
Yeah.
say they have someone who's funded them, the technology company, and they need to charge over all their assets. How does that work with the other people who you've got your stuff in escrow, but you've got now someone who's...
You mean like an administrator come in, taking over, trying to gain out value of the thing? Yeah, so the actual legal agreement for escrow typically says that anyone appointed, taken over that will provide the rights to this. So they effectively have a perpetual license as part of the escrow to continue to use the software. So as long as they've got access to it and they get access through us, we're able to release the materials to them.
Yeah. One thing I might add, and I spoke about, ours is multi-tenancy. Like our code actually isn't our IP, right? Our IP is everything else we do. Like our code enables that, but they're APIs, right? So when, even now you can go and see what our API, what they are, and you could configure to actually call them. You won't have access because we won't give you the key, but I mean, you can basically look at it, it's open, it's a visible code, right? So that's one of the things we would actually say, we deliver APIs that are the same for everyone, but we will configure them differently for specific customers, right? So we basically, when we speak with our customers, this particular one has a way that they want to calculate interest on a monthly basis, right? We're like, that's your IP, right? How that calculation works is yours, but the APIs that you use to call it are exactly the same. So in that question, that's why we can have a multi-tenancy agreement, because 3 of our customers, if they all had the escrow arrangement, could all get the same set of code. Ask Nathan exactly how that would work, but but what would be different is their databases, right? So we actually separate out the databases of their.
What if the new person who owns it doesn't want that to happen?
In reality, a client doesn't want to run their own service. It's the reason why they've hired a third-party service provider to do it. So whatever support they will get after a trigger event, they will absolutely take. Like, they don't want to be running their own thing. Like, this is a last resort type situation.
I mean, the person who's got a charge over the liquidator comes in.
Okay.
You're more talking about from a bankruptcy perspective,
Yeah.
right? So I'm not a bankruptcy lawyer, so I'm going to caveat that. But my understanding is one of the reasons escrow arrangements work is because that interest is then still subject to those escrow interests, right? So whatever they would take, whatever the administrator would take, and then whoever ended up getting that is all then subject to that security interest of the escrow arrangement, right? So they couldn't shut off, let's say it was a perpetual license to that product, they couldn't turn that off generally. But again, I'm not a bankruptcy lawyer, so it gets a lot more complicated than that, right? But I do think there is some priority to those interests, which is why escrow arrangements are used to provide protection against insolvency risk.
Yeah, it's like pre-authorized consent to give them do something, and I sort of said it's essentially a perpetual license to continue to use it, or that could be limited. So we see limitations based on country or time period or whatever situation. Obviously, liquidators they would prefer not to be there, so they can try and extract as much value from the client as possible. But ultimately, the company who's done it it's not really in their interest because they're trying to support their customer when they put the agreement in place originally to support that sales process. Does that answer your question? We good? Good. Have you got a specific situation you want to?
That's fine.
Cover off? Okay, cool. Yeah, so in terms of your experience then, you mentioned around the automated deposits. Anything else in terms of kind of setup or maybe negotiation or during that process of when the initial discussion came about, then through to delivering the actual solution?
Yeah, so our challenge was never with Escrow London. It was actually quite easy. Like the terms are pretty standard.
Yeah.
I think our third party, the other beneficiary, had lots of questions and details and just misunderstanding of what escrow was. I think in their particular case, they thought that we would deposit the code and then that they would have the right to inspect the code, which is not. So if anyone says you need escrow and we can inspect the code, those two things are not the same. And they don't work hand in hand, right? So we had spent a long time basically saying to them, no, it's with Escrow London. And Escrow London has services where you can, on top of that, and we basically said to our customer, if you want verification of the code, Escrow London has a service that you can pay to actually do that. They'll verify that it's working code, but your own developers and your own team are not going to be the ones that do that because that puts that's a risk for us. Right, so we had to push back on that, and we had to stand firm on that. But I think we had great support from Escrow London, just like that. No, that's not how this works. It never works that way. I think that was probably negotiation was probably the most difficult part. Once we actually got to the point of signing and getting them our beneficiary to sign the multi-tenancy agreement, then basically it took maybe a couple of hours to make sure we got the Git repository to Escrow London copy set up. We again had a support from our team, our support partners at DNX. And then, the last one was we had some work to do to basically, because the way that we had logically separated or logical instances of the database. We just needed to make sure that there was a database that was being copied once our client went live. So that daily production is automatically every morning at 3 a.m., I think, Marcus? Yeah, 3 a.m. basically everything that's available in the database is copied over. And so it just sits there in escrow. The cost is not prohibitive at all. And again, like I said, we can sell it as a additional service and feature that's available to any subsequent customers.
It's interesting you talk about the multi-tenancy. So yeah, there's different types of legal agreements. We also come across different deployment structures. So whether we have single tenanted deployments for each client, often banks will want their own deployment or version of the software that you run and operate for them. Also, we do come across multi-tenant situations where obviously it's maybe more cost effective for you guys to run your own service with a multi-shared environment, sharing resources, things like that. But yeah, it is a bit more complex when trying to think about actually how do we build a continuity plan for the client and what do they actually need, what assets do they need, what would need to be redeployed if something was to happen, things like that. So yeah, we've seen situations where clients actually then want, they actually start going into this in reality, they're thinking about actually maybe we do need our own tenancy and how do we go about delivering that from what you've got today. But from our side, it builds a really, really strong relationship at that point where you can work with the client to think, this is what do you actually need us to deliver, and we can work with you on it and hopefully build a long-lasting relationship with the client. And that's generally how we see it. So typically then once it's in place, it's running in the background for the lifespan of the license. Yeah, anything to add on?
Yeah, we've had no issues. I think Marcus had to set it up, but once he did it, then it's it works, and it's just copied every single day. The only thing we have to be aware of is we create a new repository. We just need to make sure that repository is added to the escrow update, but that's it. It's pretty simple.
Okay.
And it's just, it's our daily, we deposit code, and then it's in Git, and then also there's a copy of that taken and goes to escrow. It's much easier again than burning it to a disk, taking it to a secure location in an armored truck, and basically going through 3 levels of ID validation before you can go in.
And previously you mentioned around the kind of go-to-market piece, potentially using it as a sales tool, but just generally when you are going to market with or to the enterprise, has that changed over time from being startup through to scale up?
Yeah, I think so. I think the more that you get customers and go through these due diligence of compliance ringers, you can basically say in advance before someone asks you 1,000 questions, this is what we are, this is what we do, this is how it's set up. So I think it's better that, I think that instills confidence, right? Because I know from when I worked at CBA and DBS before that, you would have vendors come in, you start asking them questions, and they'd say, I don't know, I need a week to get back to you, or I need some time, and just like that doesn't instill confidence. That risk management aspect of you thinks this doesn't feel good. But if you can actually get on the front foot and basically say, we have this, 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 we do this, we do this. People, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to go with you, but that at least instills more confidence than saying, I don't know, I need to get back to you. Not that that's a bad answer, like it's just the reality sometimes, but
So just on that service you're providing then to the customer as this escrow service that sits outside the rest of things you do, can you give us a ballpark idea of what that cost is for the end customer? Just to go rough.
Yeah, good. Turn that over to you.
Yeah, I mean, a basic.
I know that you're going to add that to the cost side, but I think the customer on the other side would get paid rather than the
okay.
service. Is the difference?
Yeah, so I think we know what it costs us per month.
Sure.
And we gave 3 times that number and said that's what it's going to be. And they negotiated down to 2 times. But, we knew we wanted to get at least 1. We got 2, so we're happy with that.
So the majority of mine are actually pretty transparent, where the prices are just there, and it's like we're willing to do it because it's going to satisfy you as our client, but you'll bear the cost of it. But other clients do like to bake it into their license agreement or pass on those costs accordingly, or additionally charge for their time to do extra services, and it can be an additional resource thing.
And I might add, right? So our customer did say, hey, we went to the website, we know exactly what it costs. Why are you charging us more? And we said, because there's time, effort, there's stuff on our side. It isn't just that. Like there's this, how we architect has to be a little bit different. So we just said, look, this is the additional cost to us, the overhead cost of actually maintaining this from our side, because Escrow London does it one way, and that's fine, but we have to make some changes to do that. And they accepted that, because I think generally it's still cheap. Like it's thousands of dollars a year. It's not tens or hundreds or millions of dollars a year. So it's not, it was a relatively minor thing in the overall scope of that contract.
And I'll just add to that. I find that is generally the case too, is the customer who wants that security is kind of generally willing to pay for that, right? They understand it is an additional cost, but if the security is that important, which is when you generally end up in these situations, then they're willing to pay something, generally, let's say, and then it becomes a negotiation.
Yeah.
Cool. Any other questions on that topic? Go for it.
This is so different than what I expected in title.
Okay.
It exceeded expectation. And so what inspired you to choose these topics? As in, because it could be something very different.
What inspired me? What else? It's obviously what we do in terms of doing this type of service, but it's obviously quite a unique niche part of the market which we absolutely understand. So part of it is just trying to educate people around what's available and to help people. But yeah, I suppose the title itself could have been generally quite broad in terms of go-to-market or sales strategies and things like that. So yeah, I don't know. I don't necessarily have a direct answer. What was the inspiration other than our core kind of business?
You're the strength of your services.
Okay, great. Go.
So just a question in terms of so business has professional indemnity. And so let's say things go wrong and the code is no longer secure and the client we can't, our members can't access the portal that you provided for us. How would professional indemnity
I'm not an insurance expert, but I think where I can go with that is the escrow is more of a protection against kind of catastrophic, it's more of business continuity.
It's a business failure.
Tool.
Yeah, business failure generally. So it's not any negligence or someone's done something wrong.
Right.
It's the business has failed, and that's not down to the individuals, giving access to data or doing anything like that. So it's generally a business failure thing that can be then defined of what that is. And the most common one is bankruptcy. But there could be other things such as sale of IP. So if you were to sell the company to maybe a competitor, things like that, people get nervous. If maybe you're going to work with your customer's competitor and things like that.
Yeah, right. Whereas your professional indemnity insurance is meant to actually cover like damages and losses and whatnot. So you would go against that to actually cover kind of a financial loss, where this is more of a protective tool to allow the customer to feel confident that there's going to be that kind of continuity or that access.
Yeah, I mean, ours isn't actual insurance, it's just the same kind of concept, but it's more of a practical measure that can provide some reassurances or a practical measure to deliver something in that event. Obviously, real insurance is actually going to provide some financial.
So at one point, we actually thought we were going to deposit code once a week or once a month. And that's interesting because that changes a little bit how you do it. Because we would say, well, look, if we have a production release, we wouldn't want to put it into escrow if we actually didn't have a warranty period of some couple of days where, like, if there was any production issues found, right? So we, at one point when we thought we were only going to deposit once a month, we thought, well, we should have end of month or production go live plus 3 to 7 days, and we're actually negotiating that a little bit. But then when we basically found out there's no additional cost to do it on a daily basis, right? Then you would basically say, well, it doesn't matter. Every single day we release code, and it's actually being put into escrow, right? So in some ways, that made our customer more comfortable because the question was, well, what is going to be the impact of defects in your code, and how will you roll that back? And it's like, well, you don't roll it back, you just roll it forward, right? You just keep depositing day by day by day. So that then actually was another miss from their perspective, because they didn't want us to be there was this apocalypse thing where they were saying you're going to be insolvent and you're going to have released code that didn't work, and all this was going to happen at the same time, and how are they going to be secured against that? And we just said, well, we'll release every day and keep updating the code if there's defects. So.
And that's, I think, just to go off of that, that's where it's important in the contract to kind of be specific around how the arrangement's going to work, right? What are those updates going to be like? What are the trigger events? What are those rights once you have access to what's in the escrow? So it is really important to get those details agreed and make sure that you've, especially as the customer there, that you've thought through what you actually need in order to kind of use the code as you would need to.
Some of the agreements that we have, are they based on you have access to the data in escrow? If you make that all.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically like, what is the definitions of insolvency? What is the proof of that? What things have to happen? So, I mean, the escrow is a definition of insolvency, and then after that.
What if it's like for performance? So they're just not happy with the way that you're doing it.
So.
Remove you and use someone else.
Yeah, okay. So that's a good question. Like they actually asked that question, and we said, and again, this is maybe being a little bit older and stubborn. I just said, are you really going to do that? Like, you're buying our code, yes, and you're buying what we have, but it's actually the service. And while you could probably find someone to develop code that fits into this pattern, you can't necessarily hire someone that actually knows the business value that we're adding specifically, right? So but then of course the question is, and I would ask them and say, like, what type of relationship do you want to have with us, right? We actually want to we want to be successful together, so we're not going to screw you. That's not our intention. Like, we want to have a successful relationship together, and we will actually show you these things. But one of those insolvency things is, again, they need to know 3 months before it happens that we don't have enough revenue to extend more than 3 months, right? So that gives them a fair amount of time. I think like it's not ideal, but it's better than nothing, and it's better than just calling them one day and being like, hey, we're out of money, right? We're turning everything off, right? We have to tell them 3 months.
I think it's from my experience, it's quite rare to have an escrow arrangement that deals with poor performance.
Yeah, so we have, we have performance, separate performance requirements, but that's not the escrow arrangement.
Your company provides a lot more than just code, though. Like,
yes, yeah.
It's not really. It's not.
Correct. So I mean, and that's, but I would actually say, for any startup scale up here, like, if you sell what you offer beyond the code, if you only sell that you offer code, then it's going to be easy to replace you. But if it's actually IP beyond that, it's much more difficult. That partnership is there. So yeah.
I have a sector question for you. We're naturally here at banking one. What about other sectors like energy? Are the electricity companies and big utilities wanting the escrow service for their service providers within the energy sector? What's happening outside of banking?
Yeah, obviously banking is a big one because of the regulation pushing them to do it. We see a lot in anywhere where software is critical. So we see a lot in logistics. We've got a lot of big customers. I mentioned the transportation, airlines, things like that. Generally, where there's a lot of development going on, a lot of innovation. So we're seeing a lot in the EV space. and transportation, where there's a lot of development going on in new technologies, lots of startups, lots of investment going in these types of areas, and that brings out some really cool tech, but then people are a bit worried about adopting it. So yeah, lots in that space. We don't have, maybe at the moment, loads of huge energy companies we work with, but a few of the smaller ones who come to us with some requirements. But I'd say logistics, banking, health services, things like that, where it's super critical that they need the uptime of the software. Go for it. Go back.
I actually have two questions. First one, very specific escrow question, the second one, broader question. But the first one, so on your escrow accounts, you have one for each instance or one for each customer. So that's the first question. The second one is really about this imbalance. And we're all sitting here as startups dealing with the imbalance every day with big companies. Very advice for how we help that imbalance.
Maybe I'll answer the second one first. So I think just on the question of the imbalance, I mean, yes, sell what you're selling, right? I was going to say, I think one of the things to really consider that we always think about is, and I don't, this is probably someone else's quote, but sell the disruption, but just help them manage the chaos, right? So if you actually can and basically say, look, this is the disruption that we provide, but we know the things that you're going to face. We care about you as a customer, and so these are the things that you're going to face, right? So, and this is how we're going to do that. This is how we do it already, and this is how we'll partner with you. So I think that's the biggest thing. I think there are huge opportunities with bigger companies, bigger enterprises, but you just have to think like them. What are they going to get in trouble for and fired for? And if you can actually manage those questions, and you say, this is my solution to help you address those, then that's the opportunity you have. So I think that's sometimes why it's good to come from industries or hire people from those industries and be like, what are they worried about? And if you know, then you can be like, well, we can manage all of these things and we can plan ahead. And I think, one of the things I would say is, so I'm older, and I think in starting a startup 20 years ago where you had to have, we're at the Scaleup hub, but that's cheaper than getting stuff. Getting your own office, that's cheaper than outfitting a complete office. We don't really have physical network infrastructure. We use Zscaler and some other tools that we actually use to, basically be anonymous wherever we are. There's lots of things. I mean, just the infrastructure perspective. I was having a discussion with our CEO. He's like, oh, your AWS costs are way too expensive. It's it's $5,000 a month, right? If you're not at a bank and you're paying millions of dollars a month, that's, and then there's cabling issues, and depending on how many different contractors you have, right? So there's a lot of things that you can say. I have experience, I know these things, and we're actually reducing costs quite drastically. People working from home is a huge advantage, right? That's just desks you don't have to have all the time. So I think there's a lot that you can sell, and basically you just have to say, we're small, but we actually do these things. Little secret, specifically from banks are really inefficient, right? There's so many people doing a lot of stuff, right? If you just show them that you can do it more efficiently, and I'll just maybe to that, what we do fund administration, and we actually automate a bunch of it. That's not hard. I mean, there's some expertise in it. But taking a massive department of 10 people that you're paying $150,000 a year to do this, and shrinking it down to basically three people that do the work for the equivalent of 6 different companies, there's a human resource cost of that. There's a risk that people just won't take on internally just to say, so they're willing to take a chance with you to basically say, I figured out this way to fix your process. And if you can sell that to them, then they can say, oh, we'll do an experiment. And their experiment with you, you're like, well, this is great revenue for me. I'm getting 10 times what I thought. And for them, it's still just a drop in the bucket. It's nothing. To answer the other question, we offer to our customers what they want to do. We said, if you want your own escrow, that's a single, I said multi-tenancy before, but we can actually get them their own agreement and charge them more for that. If there's other customers that want multi-tenancy, then we can do that as well. Right? So it's flexible, but it's just how much do you want to ask them, the beneficiary, how much they want to pay.
I might just jump on the leverage point from I think there's two things really. Is one, as Greg was saying, is knowing the pain points of your client, right, and what they're going to be concerned about. So, data and security, for instance, right now, every client is really concerned about that. So knowing how you are actually using data, what those data flows are, so you can actually say, okay, we've looked into this. So knowing those pain points and being prepared for those, but also knowing your own risk profile and saying, okay, these are our kind of deal breakers. This is what we really care about. This is what we have priced this for. This is the amount of risk that we're kind of willing to take, and actually having a good sense of that will really help, at least with some of those stickier points when you get to liability and indemnities and things like that. But then it's just having kind of that risk profile of saying, okay, are we willing to take a little bit more risk on this because it's worth it or not? But having a clear view on that at the beginning will really help to, I think, expedite and allow you to focus on the key issues rather than just kind of going back and forth or being overwhelmed when you see the bank's paper because it's 120 pages long.
Cool. I'm conscious we're out of time, so I'm happy to stay for any further questions if anyone wants to chat afterwards. But appreciate time is money, right? So I'd like to thank you both, Greg. I really appreciate your support. Thanks for your questions and your input.